Does the Alamo lie to visitors? If facts are presented to a historian, but he chooses not to read them, do those facts cease to exist? Today, we're looking at one historian's take on a visit to the Alamo and asking, did his eyes deceive him, or is he deceiving us? As you all may guess, all of us at Texas History Trust spend a fair amount of time reading history. I watch a lot of history too, and one of the YouTube channels that I watch is called Cynical Historian. It's hosted by a recent PhD fellow out in Nevada. I don't always agree with his takes, but I sometimes find new things to explore from his videos, and well, that's what learning's all about. A couple weeks ago, he published a video titled How Museums Lie, and half of it was about the Alamo. So I watched it through and saw some glaring errors and thought it warranted a response. So if you'll indulge me for just a bit, we're going to make that response now. Let's get into it. Cynical Historian visited the Alamo twice, once in 2018 and again in October 2022. And he's talking about what he saw in the context of how museums should comport themselves. He starts by examining the mission statement of the nonprofit that runs the Alamo.
Their mission is to preserve the Alamo, the shrine of Texas liberty, and bring its own unique story to life, to inspire visitors and honor all those who lived, fought, and died here. You can tell from that statement they have a particularly celebratory mission.
Preservation, inspiration, honoring the dead. That's all pretty standard mission statement stuff. Probably the word shrine is what's problematic for you. The Alamo is a historic site with a long multicultural past, and a part of that past makes it a war memorial. People from around the world make a pilgrimage to pay their respects at the Alamo Church for that reason, dating back to the 1830s. When, a year after the Alamo fell, Colonel Juan Seguin was giving a military burial to some of the ashes of Alamo defenders, he referred to them as hallowed relics, and invoked the genius of liberty looking down from her lofty seat, smiling with approbation upon our proceedings. Seguin's speech was printed in Spanish, just as it was delivered in person at the funeral, alongside an English translation in the paper of record, the Telegraph and Texas Register, in March 1837. To Seguin's remarks was appended the following in part. In after times, when peace shall have returned to smile upon our prosperous country, the votaries of freedom shall yearly assemble to celebrate at this tomb of heroes the mighty achievements of the unreturning brave. Hallowed relics, votaries, hallowed ground, tomb of heroes, liberty, annual assembly. In other words, a pilgrimage to a shrine. The Alamo has been viewed as a shrine since Colonel Seguin interred the ashes of the defenders near the site of one of the funeral pyres in 1837.
Requiring triumphalism means they will purposefully avoid history that tarnishes that narrative. Of course, bringing its own unique story to life means that it would have to bring up those things, so their mission statement is actually inherently contradictory.
That's a lot of juice to squeeze out of a simple mission statement. It's a pretty vague statement that says nothing detailed about interpretation or avoidance. And words have meanings. Unique has a meaning. The history of the Alamo over the centuries is indeed one of a kind, and that's what unique means. You seem to be implying that unique means, or should mean, warts and all, or encyclopedic, or something akin to that, but it absolutely does not. I fully support a comprehensive history, and the Alamo is told a pretty complete story that's limited by exhibition space. Maybe it conflicts with you, but I don't agree that the mission statement conflicts with itself.
In a report I wrote from my first visit, I said, the Alamo is trying to project a new interpretation of the site. They can only do so subtly because it is a contested interpretation, and has only recently been implemented.
Change? Yes. Changes in interpretation? Not necessarily. In 2018, change was everywhere at the Alamo. It was under new management. A veteran museum professional, Doug McDonald, became CEO of the nonprofit that oversees the Alamo's operations. But there were already trained history professionals working on the interpretation at the Alamo. Dr. Bruce Winders, Ernesto Rodriguez, and later Colby Lanham. So changes in how that interpretation was showcased came with the hiring of a seasoned museum guy. In tandem with new leadership, unprecedented changes were flooding in 2018. The $500 million with a B, $500 million plan to build a museum facility on Alamo Plaza and reveal the full historic footprint of the Alamo complex had just been approved. So 2018 was not a simple matter of subtle changes in interpretation. 2018 marked the beginning of a massive overhaul of the entire site, including major conservation efforts for the historic structures. But you don't mention any of this, so I'm curious. Since you've never been to the Alamo before 2018 and had no experience to compare it with, how did you perceive new and subtle changes in interpretation? And of the sources you cite, Montejano and Forget the Alamo, the former stops at 1986, and the latter, well, that just claims 2018 marked a return to the John Wayne narrative. And besides that, Forget the Alamo wasn't published till 2021. So I'm a little confused and a lot curious about what informed that opinion.
They are subverting expectations of triumphalism by broadening the context of racial diversity.
Alrighty, so a word about triumphalism, particularly in Texas. That Texas triumphed over Mexico using a battle cry inspired by the fall of the Alamo is not in the 21st century akin to woohoo, white people beat brown people. That's reductive and retrograde thinking. It's not 1950. The victory at San Jacinto was a Texas victory that's significant to all Texans because, well, it made us Texans, and Texans, as you know, come in every ethnic admixture you can imagine. That victory, by the way, was won by a multi-ethnic fighting force, which is discussed at the Alamo.
Unfortunately, I couldn't take any photos inside that time because of their rules of reverence, an abominable way to control visitor behavior.
War memorials, and that's what the Alamo Church is to most who enter it. Many of them, anyway, have an etiquette policy. At Pearl Harbor, there's a reverence and respect dress code. Arlington National Cemetery has a silence and respect policy, as well as advice that visitors should honor the American flag. At bare minimum, the rules of reverence at the Alamo remind people it's just good manners to remove their hat when they enter a church. But it turns out controlled visitor behavior also matters in an old limestone structure that is literally crumbling every day. The no photos deal, I'm sure you know, is a holdover from the bygone days of flash photography. Flashes from millions of cameras every year damaged artwork and light-sensitive items like paper and ink. Now that everybody has a low-light photography device in their hand and there's no sensitive items displayed in the Alamo Church, photography is allowed.
More interesting is what happens later at the Alamo. For the most part, the site got neglected.
You show us a graphic of the Alamo without a roof under your comment about neglect. But that ain't neglect. It's literally what people saw in 1836. And you say the site was neglected, but you don't say why or by whom. But I've seen this movie, I know where this is going, and I know how it ends. Texas historians, Walter Binger and others come to mind, offer up neglect as proof that Anglo-Texans completely ignored the Alamo until they needed it for racial reasons. They omit that the neglect came from the Alamo's owners, the Catholic diocese, who owned the church until the 1880s. They actually sued the Republic of Texas for ownership in 1841 and won. Now, the whole place had been secularized, so I don't really fault them for not spending money on it. But they also didn't part with it until after Reconstruction ended for anyone else to preserve it. Historians also conveniently omit that the Alamo Church we see today is a half-finished replacement for one that collapsed in, I think, the 1740s. This is what the finished Alamo Church was intended to look like, similar to the other Spanish missions in San Antonio, but the roof and the bell towers were never completed. Though it did suffer more damage during and after the battle, the church wasn't in great shape before the battle.
It became a U.S. Army barracks for a few decades, being abandoned in 1876. Then it became the backdrop building of a mercantile firm until 1904, when the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, or simply DRT, bought it with a loan from local philanthropist Clara Driscoll.
No, they didn't buy the Alamo as in the church with a loan from Clara Driscoll. The state already owned the church. They bought it from the diocese in 1883. Clara fronted the money for the Long Barrack, the other historic structure on the site. And then the state bought the Long Barrack from Miss Driscoll.
The DRT tried to lease the Long Barracks to an outside firm. In protest, Adina Amelia de Zavala, who was the granddaughter of a Texas revolutionary, shut herself in against a sheriff trying to evict her from the barracks for 3 days in 1908. She successfully got the building kept in public hands, despite Driscoll attempting to make a profit for the organization.
So much is not right here. DRT has always been a charitable organization, so nobody was trying to make a profit. No, DRT didn't try to lease the Long Barrack to an outside firm, and both women you mentioned are descended from Texas revolutionaries, not just Miss Zavala. Adina was a DRT member when she shut herself in at the Long Barrack. Clara was a DRT member when Adina shut herself in at the Long Barrack. They were arguing over the preservation of the Long Barrack.
The DRT became increasingly anti-Hispanic as the nation as a whole became more xenophobic, passing the 1924 Quota Act, severely limiting Latino immigration.
Actually, the Johnson-Reed Act, also known as the 1924 Quota Act, 100% did not target Hispanics. Mexico, as a matter of fact, was completely exempt from the Johnson-Reed Act. Immigrants from the entire Western Hemisphere were exempt from the Johnson-Reed Act. So, 1924 Quota Act had zero to do with the Alamo and nada to do with Spanish-speaking people from anywhere except those from Europe. That's who the act targeted. And let's take a sidebar to talk about Adina and Clara just a little bit, since you seem to think that the rift in DRT was a racial one. And I repeat myself, but I feel like I need to. The state bought the church in 1883. The Long Barrack, another part of the Alamo complex, created the rift in the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. When the church began selling off chunks of the plaza, the Long Barrack fell into private hands. Now, Adina de Zavala knew that the two-story Long Barrack was original to the Alamo, and she got first dibs from the owners if they ever decided to sell. When they wanted to sell, they actually gave her a holler, and the DRT tried to raise the funds to buy it. But in the meantime, the owners were courting capitalists who wanted to build a hotel there. So Clara Driscoll ponied up the cash to buy the Long Barrack, and then the state of Texas bought it from her and turned stewardship of the whole Alamo over to DRT, and that's the condensed version of events. Here comes the rift. To Zavala, the Alamo was the church plus the Long Barrack. Driscoll viewed the church as the Alamo and felt the two-story Long Barrack distracted from the church. Driscoll thought that if the Long Barrack was going to stay, its walls should be covered in ivy and pretty climbing vines and a park laid out nearby, similar to the ancient ruins she'd seen in Europe. So the fissure in the Daughters of the Republic of Texas was a matter of limestone, not skin tone.
For instance, they placed the Cenotaph in 1940 that had a list of defenders from Amelia Williams, which was grossly inaccurate and purposefully avoided Hispanic names.
I had a question for you. If Williams' work and the Cenotaph purposefully avoided Hispanic names, how come there are Hispanic names chiseled into the monument? Do you think that the DRT and Miss Williams mistaked Lozoya, Padilla, Guerrero, and Esparza, all of whom are on the Cenotaph, for Anglo names? It's worth pointing out here, the Cenotaph was erected as a memorial to all those who died at the Alamo. Most of the Tejanos who started out inside the walls availed Santa Anna of his amnesty offer or left as couriers. That fact alone significantly diminishes the number of Hispanic names available, the number of Hispanic men available to die and then have their names on the Cenotaph. And some names like Guerrero shouldn't be there, but others like Abamillo should be. And the same goes with some Anglo names. The Cenotaph was a product of the Texas Centennial celebration in 1936. That's the reason for the timing, not a Quota Act passed 12 years prior. And some of my audience is probably going to recognize the book cover design as one of mine from my day job, but that's totally not the reason for this video. It's just a happy coincidence. Williams' 1920s research was based on the earliest list of names published after the battle, plus the extant military documents she had access to. In the ensuing century, since her research, I think we have maybe 9 or 10 more names confirmed that should be added to the list. Is that grossly inaccurate? Nah.
In the 1990s, a series of problems with upkeep proved that the DRT was neglecting their duties. The controversy got them to change some of the site's interpretation to include stuff about mission neophytes and emphasize some of the archaeological work throughout the area.
Why would problems with upkeep result in a change of interpretation? That doesn't make sense to me. If the building is falling apart, talking more about the mission era ain't gonna help. The mid-90s were another time of change at the Alamo, kind of like what's happening now, but on a smaller scale. Conservation talk was in the air, the DRT's Alamo curator moved on to another job, and a trained historian, Dr. Bruce Winders, with expertise in early Texas history, was hired as curator. Ernesto Rodriguez, another excellent scholar, was hired in, I think, 1999 to assist Dr. Winders. I think that helped move the site's interpretation along more than any controversy did.
This controversy with upkeep in that was revived in 2010 when an investigation proved that they had been mismanaging funds.
No, the controversy wasn't revived. It never truly died down. There was internal conflict in DRT over funding and management, and that spilled out into the public when a DRT member reported the organization to the state attorney general's office. Then the governor's office got involved, and, well, it was a whole big thing.
Leading to the transfer of ownership to Texas as a whole.
No transfer and ownership. The state of Texas has never stopped owning the church and the Long Barrack. The DRT were only stewards of the site. In 2011, a new law assigned state oversight of the Alamo to the General Land Office, but DRT still managed operations. In 2015, ties between DRT and operations at the Alamo were cut by then Land Commissioner George P. Bush.
We can surmise 4 pressure points of interpretation: Hispanic inclusion, neophytes from the Spanish period, the existence of slavery, and use of the location as a symbol. Only one of those is actually applied by agreement of the DRT from both of my visits.
Okay, again, DRT had nothing to do with what you saw on either of your visits, but let's explore those pressure points.
They highlight much of the history of the mission prior to its abandonment in 1793. Now, neither time had any mention of slavery whatsoever, including issues related to slavery that contributed to Texian frustrations in 1835, and the use of the buildings by Confederates.
You just showed us 2 panels of the Wall of History and say the Alamo is silent on Confederate occupation, but earlier, though, you cycled through all the panels, including the one that shows the Alamo under Confederate control, exactly where it should appear in this condensed timeline. And here's the introduction panel that greeted all visitors in 2022 in the exhibit hall, front and center, that references Confederate occupation. Here's the relevant part of the exhibit that was up during your 2022 visit that says, Anglo settlers brought slaves with them. The thing about exhibit panels is that you have to read them.
Now, I will point out that it's become a bit of a myth that the Texas Revolution was mostly to preserve their slaves, something one of the books in my bibliography is particularly bad at.
That book was particularly bad in its takes about slavery and failed in a host of other ways, too, because it was not, as your caption suggests, a book written by historians. It was written by journalists, and the proof is in the pudding.
The interesting difference between my visits was Hispanic inclusion. When I went there in 2018, there was plenty of information throughout. There was also a specific panel in one of the halls about the Mexican perspective of the battle.
There are still panels on the plaza where they've always been that give the perspective of Mexican correspondents like Cano and Pena. Those haven't gone anywhere. They were there for both of your visits. In 2022, you'd have also seen panels that give Santa Anna's battle orders.
When I returned in 2022, none of that remained.
Those are 2018 exhibit panels, not 2022. Let me explain. In 2018, the exhibit on display in the exhibit annex was called Fortress Alamo, a visual display of how San Antonio developed as a military city, and the Alamo as a key component in that. In 2019, a new exhibit replaced it. It's called The Alamo, A Story Bigger Than Texas. That exhibit remained in place with few exceptions until the Ralston Family Collections building opened in March 2023. So that's what you saw in 2022. Both were written by Dr. Bruce Winders, a trained historian, and both included Hispanics. Let me show you what you saw or should have seen in 2022. Here are the Canary Islanders. Here's the socioeconomic interaction between Tejano and Anglo settlers. Here's the flying company that gave the Alamo its name. Here's Mexico's fight for independence from Spain. So much exclusion, huh?
Instead, they doubled down on tiny and honestly insignificant details from the battle.
Those tiny and honestly insignificant details pertaining to the battle are ways that we can show visitors that the Alamo was far more than just two structures for most of its life. In 2018, there were plans to showcase the full expanse of the Alamo footprint in dramatic ways, either with walls or with lowering the grade, or both, but that's not the plan we ended up with. The 18-pounder cannon exhibit and Lozoya House, which you showed a picture of earlier, is one insignificant detail that brings attention to both an important battle relic and the home of a Tejano Alamo defender. Lozoya's life is a snapshot of the complexity of the site and of early Texas history. He was born in San Antonio when Mexico was still Nuevo España. He fought for the Mexican army after they gained independence, and then for Texas in the Texas Revolution because he didn't like centralism. So much exclusion. The Palisade depicts another delineating point that helps people understand the configuration of the plaza in 1836. The new lunette and main gate show visitors how the mission was entered from the south when the walls were still standing. This was the main entrance to the complex. I don't think that's small or inconsequential.
They kept the stuff about Hispanics who were on the Texas side, but only portrayed Santa Anna's force as invaders.
There is no language about invasion at the Alamo. I assume the reason you're not illustrating this claim with a simple photograph is because no such thing exists. You know who referenced Santa Anna's force as invaders? William Barrett Travis in letters written from the Alamo in 1836. He used the word invaders, but no exhibit at the site uses that verbiage.
A distinctly partisan stance, given it was a rebellion. They were trying to defeat a rebellion. Duh.
Here's the wording, straight from the 2022 exhibit, which you should have seen, or did see but didn't read. Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna assembled a 6,500-man army to crush the Texas Rebellion, which is precisely accurate. Duh.
This invasion narrative is an obvious attempt to associate the attack of the Alamo with illegal immigrants today, a distinctly prejudicial interpretation commonly used to drum up anti-Hispanic sentiment.
Is it obviously a modern political statement? Or are you just offended that the Alamo describes the defenders as heroic and Texas as victorious over a Mexican dictator in a city that's largely Hispanic? It was a Texas victory, a victory that unites us as Texans with a common history. If you're not from here but also happen to not be a 19th century tyrant, you're probably still okay. Dude, if you want the site to devote entire interpretive panels to the history of racism across time and across the state, then say so. But to claim there's some outrageous political narrative presented there that you completely failed to show, choosing instead to roll footage of a 1960 movie under your voiceover to suggest racial overtones of 1960, I'm guessing, either that or you're just a John Wayne superfan. Either way, that's no bueno. You have to show the panels that contain this phantom invasion narrative, or some wording that comes close. I've shown you where it's not. Please show me what you interpret as invasion.
This erasure perpetuates the anti-Hispanic mythology of the Alamo and directly violates their mission statement to bring the Alamo's own unique story to life.
Whoa. Who are we erasing in this erasure? We were just talking about invasion. I'm sure this was just an editing mistake, but it's an important one. If you're referring to Hispanic erasure, well, I've already demonstrated how omnipresent Hispanics are in the Alamo interpretation because it's hard to avoid the history of Spanish-speaking peoples in a place settled by Canary Islanders at a Spanish mission that became a fort named for a company of Spanish lancers that was won from and then taken back by a Mexican military force. That's all on display because it's all integral to the story. So where's the erasure? Maybe it's in a dark corner drinking a cold beer with the invasion narrative? My best guess.
Beyond that specific problem, it also hinders the community of Texas as a whole, which it's supposed to serve. Roughly 40% of Texans are Hispanic.
40% of Texans may be of Hispanic descent, but why do you assume all Hispanic people think of race when they consider the Alamo? They are, after all, Texans. And for what it's worth, market data from 2018, available on the Alamo's website, shows that Hispanics hold a remarkably positive view of the site. Furthermore, the Alamo serves more than just Texas, they serve the visiting public. That same demographic data shows that more than half the Alamo's visitors come from outside of Texas, more than 10% from outside the US, and only 7% are locals. So that's who the site serves, the visiting public.
Let alone the more than 12% black residents who get no representation through avoidance of the issue of slavery throughout the site altogether.
Why is slavery the only way to represent African Americans? The first messenger of the Alamo's fall was a black man, an enslaved black man named Joe. There is no Alamo story without his testimony and the testimony of a woman who survived to tell it. Hendrik Arnold, a man of African descent, is depicted in bronze at the site. Those were real people who had a real role in the history of San Antonio and of the Alamo. Not that slaves weren't real people, but in San Antonio, they weren't much present because the economy of the interior of Texas was much different than that of East Texas, plantation country. So it just doesn't occupy much space and shouldn't occupy much space at a historic site in central Texas.
But you also have to understand that they are required by that mission statement to maintain a triumphalist narrative, despite Texas obviously losing the battle.
Okay, you know that the loss of life at the Alamo, the massacre at Goliad, were turned into a battle cry at San Jacinto, which is the reason why people have remembered the Alamo since 1836. Oh, and in 2022, there was just one panel, actually half a panel, on San Jacinto at the exhibit you saw. Oh, so much triumphalism.
But as long as they treat it like a shrine for Texas, rather than a historical site, that unique story, and honor all of those who lived, fought, and died here, which includes the more than 400 Mexican casualties during that battle, which is 2 or 3 times the amount of Texans killed, will be contradictory to keeping it as a shrine to Texas liberty. At least if they're honest with themselves.
So, in order for it not to be triumphalist, the Alamo should memorialize the Mexican soldados or stop calling the place a shrine? Is that it? The Mexican soldiers who perished at the site are referenced at the Alamo, but they're not memorialized. And I don't think anyone finds that weird. And I don't think Mexico's ever requested such a thing. There's a cemetery in Mexico City for Americans who died in the Mexican-American War. Why? Because the U.S. Congress asked for that and paid for it and pays to maintain it. There's no Confederate monuments in the northern states. Most Union monuments in the southern states are on federal land. And how many monuments to British soldiers can you find in New England? That's the nature of post-conflict, with few exceptions, whether you like it or not.
So now you see how the history of the place and museology combine to show that there is a clear disservice here.
So you could not have missed this while you were there in 2022. There was construction everywhere, huge coming soon signs, and you don't mention that at all. So I will. The new collection center is a temporary exhibition space, while the multi-story museum building across from the Alamo Church is built. For years now, historians and activists and everyone in between have debated over what interpretation should be in each area of the museum and how much space is given to each era and each group. And that debate, I promise you, will continue long after the museum opens, because the Alamo is an international symbol of strength in the face of overwhelming odds. It's visited more than the Statue of Freaking Liberty. To most, it represents an obstinate and deadly stand against a capricious dictator. To fans of this book, it represents slavery. Still, others view it as a burial ground for indigenous people, and everything that happened beyond that is irrelevant. The point is, everybody has an attachment to it, and everybody wants their particular view, no matter how well documented or how unfounded, to hold the spotlight. I hope and pray that the historical record and nothing else is what prevails in the final interpretation. I appreciate your video content. I don't always agree with you, but I watch it to support it because I know every minute of watch time matters. But when you make boisterous claims about exclusion and invasion that are based not on synthesized history, but on personal visits, and then don't back them up with a single evidentiary photograph of those claims, that makes them suspicious. Photos were allowed everywhere but the church, and the exhibits weren't even in the church. That you didn't research enough to know who owns the site or who owned the site. The DRT is no longer involved with the site. That doesn't seem up to your standards. Don't be another Alamo partisan relying on claims made by others when you had the opportunity to see the facts for yourself. Just because you didn't read them doesn't mean the facts aren't there for the visiting public. So that's it for us today. I hope that we've given our cynical historian friend and all of y'all some fodder for thought. The Alamo will retain its title as the Shrine of Texas Liberty, as it has been since a Tejano buried the ashes of the defenders in 1837. It can be that and still tell the full, long, complicated story of the place. Two things can be true at once. Until next time, God in Texas, y'all.